Punishment. The inevitable consequences of doing something wrong or doing something that the rest of society doesn't like. As civilization developed, so too did the ways in which people punished those who broke the rules. The development of prisons throughout history has followed a complicated, windy path. Certain cultures simply like to end people's lives who did bad things rather than keep them in a cell. Others, think medieval times, seem to love dungeons and chambers where they did some pretty awful things. Let's take a look at the evolution of prisons throughout history and some of the worst ones that have ever been built. Mammertine Prison, 7th century BC. Let's kick it off with one of Rome's most notorious prisons, a place where St. Peter might have spent some time before he was executed, and just an all-around bad place to be. It's thought that Mammertine Prison was built sometime in the 7th century BC, but the exact dates are unknown. It was pretty much fully booked between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, a time of peak Roman chaos where all kinds of backstabby things were going on as the Roman Republic was overthrown and became the Roman Empire. Prisoners at Mammertine during Roman times usually weren't held there too long. Extended incarceration really wasn't a thing back then.
But most often, the prisoners held there were tortured, beaten by guards, and subjected to simulated drowning, starved, and then, in a lot of cases, eventually crucified.
This is supposedly what happened to St. Peter, who was in prison there before his crucifixion. A lot of what we know about Peter's stay at Mammertine comes from the New Testament, and the story goes that Peter was locked up for his preaching and teachings, which were seen as a threat to the Roman Empire. While in prison, he supposedly performed miracles like healing a guard's daughter, which led to the conversion of several of the guards and other prisoners. In the end, though, the miracles couldn't save him, and Peter was eventually sentenced to death by the Roman authorities. According to tradition, he was crucified upside down because he believed that he wasn't worthy of being crucified like his hero, Jesus. And if you didn't go by way of crucifixion, there was a good chance you might have been thrown off a cliff in the grand finale of your stay at Mammertine. Near the prison was a lovely place called Tarpeian Rock. According to Roman legend, the rock was named after a young woman named Tarpeia, who betrayed the city of Rome in exchange for some golden bracelets. As punishment for her treachery, she was thrown off the cliff by the Roman soldiers. And they kept the tradition going. Loads of Roman politicians, generals, and nobles were tossed off the rock for various plots to overthrow people and other treacherous crimes over the years. The Palace of the Inquisition, 1732 to 1838. When we think of the Spanish Inquisition, most of us probably think it only happened in Spain. But don't forget, Fernando, the Spanish loved colonizing back in the day, and they particularly loved South America and all of its gold and silver. So it is really no surprise that the Inquisition and all of its brutality leaked over to the New World. And one of the most infamous prisons wasn't a place you'd want to find yourself in. This New World Inquisition, officially known as the Inquisition in the Americas, was established in the early 16th century, soon after the Spanish and Portuguese arrived on the continent. Just like in Spain and Portugal, leaders wanted religious orthodoxy, but only orthodoxy that involved Catholicism. Indigenous populations were forced to convert or else face the mighty backhand slap of God. And that mighty backhand slap often meant a trip to the Palace of the Inquisition, the little shops of horrors that lay inside. The Palace of the Inquisition was in Cartagena, Colombia. Built in 1777, it became the uncomfortable last home for many people in the Americas accused of un-Catholic behaviors like witchcraft and voodoo and anything else perceived as a threat to the Catholic faith. When you got to the palace, you were in for a heck of a time. Torture was a common method used by the Inquisition to extract confessions from those accused, and the Palace of the Inquisition was no exception. Here are some of the unsavory things that went on in the dark corners of the palace. First up, the rack. The rack was a torture device that involved stretching the body of the accused until their joints were dislocated or even torn from their sockets. It was an excruciatingly painful method of torture that was used to extract confessions or to punish those who refused to confess. Then there was the strappado. This one involved suspending the accused from a rope which was tied to their hands or wrist. The unfortunate heretic would then be lifted off the ground, causing their arms to be dislocated or broken.
And years before Guantanamo ever existed, the palace used the now famous method of controlled drowning.
The sensation of drowning was often used as a way to terrorize the accused into confessions. Confessions that were obviously forced and wouldn't, hold water today. Finally, there was the wheel. The wheel was a torture device that involved tying the accused to a large wheel and then breaking their bones with a heavy iron bar. The spokes of the wheel would act as props that made the breaking of bones particularly easy and horrible. This one was an extremely brutal way to go that was often used to execute those who were found guilty of heresy. The Barathon, ancient Greece.
If getting pushed off a cliff isn't your thing, how about being trapped in a bottomless pit? The Romans and the ancient Greeks had some pretty horrible prisons in their time. One of the worst was called the Barathon.
The Barathon was a notorious prison in ancient Athens that was located in a deep pit beneath the Areopagus, a hill near the Acropolis. It was used as early as the 5th century BCE, though it's not certain when it fell out of favor as a prison. The term Barathon literally means bottomless pit in Greek, although unlike your brunch mimosas, the prison wasn't actually bottomless. Did you know that the ancient Greeks invented the mimosa? No, they didn't. But if you've had enough mimosas at one time, you could probably believe anything. The Barathon was used to hold prisoners who had been sentenced to death or exile, and the conditions in the prison were pretty gross. Prisoners were often just thrown into the pit and left to die of hunger and thirst, but not before rotting in their own excrement. The use of the Barathon as a prison was controversial even in ancient times, and some Athenians believed that it was a cruel and inhumane form of punishment. In fact, some prisoners who were sentenced to death by the Athenian courts were given the option of drinking hemlock and going the way Socrates did instead of being thrown into the hole. The Barathon was mentioned quite a few times by ancient historians over the years. Aristotle, for example, mentioned it in his work, Constitution of the Athenians, where he described the prison as a place where people convicted of crimes against the state were thrown into a deep pit and left to rot. The Roman historian Plutarch also wrote about the Barathon in his work Life of Solon, where he described it as a place where the worst criminals were confined in a kind of subterranean pit.
Pontefract Castle, 1070 to 1649.
Let's move into the medieval ages now, a time when people really enjoyed throwing criminals and potential usurpers of thrones into cold, dark, damp dungeons, either to rot or to be tortured in all kinds of hideous ways.
First up, we have the Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, England. It was built in 1070 during the reign of William the Conqueror, the Viking descendant who became the first Norman king of England a few years earlier. But the dungeons below the castle really kicked into high gear towards the end of the 14th century. During the reign of King Richard II, the castle became a dark torture chamber and a place where King Richard himself ended up wasting away. He was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who would later become King Henry IV. Richard II was imprisoned in Pontefract, where he died under mysterious circumstances. He may have been starved to death or even suffocated under orders from Henry. It was a huge scandal in medieval England, and rumors of Henry's hand in Richard's death persisted for years after the king was gone. Pontefract Castle was also used as a prison during the War of the Roses in the 15th century. When you think War of the Roses, think Game of Thrones type stuff. The House of Lancaster was fighting against the House of York for control of Westeros. Sorry, England. Throughout the wars, the castle was controlled by the Lannisters, Lancasters, and was used to imprison and torture Yorkist supporters. It then became a place where religious dissidents came to die. In the 16th century, during the reign of King Henry VIII, who was a Protestant, Pontefract Castle was used as a prison and a torture chamber for Catholic dissidents. One of the most famous victims during this time was the Catholic activist Margaret Clitheroe, who was imprisoned in the castle and then executed in York in 1586, and her execution wasn't a quick one. She was crushed to death by her own door as heavy rocks were slowly placed on top of it. It was the same door she opened up to Catholics seeking safety from persecution. Medieval executions were really quite horribly creative. Then, during the English Civil War in the 17th century, Pontefract Castle was used as a royalist stronghold and was besieged 3 times by parliamentarian forces. In this civil war, think Long Live the Queen versus We Want Democracy. After the final siege in 1649, the castle was partially demolished, and its use as a prison and torture chamber finally came to an end.
The Tower of London, 1100 to 1952.
Right around the time Pontefract Castle was built, another castle/prison went up in London under the orders of William the Conqueror. The Tower of London takes the ignominious prize of being one of the longest continually used prisons in history.
The first part of the complex, which is much more than just a tower, was built in 1066, and part of the complex was turned into a prison and execution site by 1100, and it continued to be used until 1952. While the Tower of London also had royal residences and fancy dining halls like many other medieval castles, it's gone down in history as a place where some horrific executions were held, but it also served as the setting for some pretty wild stories over the years. First, let's get into the executions. There were all kinds of ways to go during medieval times, and while the methods we're about to mention were by no means unique to the Tower of London, the tower was basically ground zero for where they happened. Beheading was the go-to method, but there were some other pretty nasty ones. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was a particularly gruesome way to go that was used for people who committed high treason. The condemned individual would be suspended from a tree until almost dead, at which point they would be taken down and tortured. After that, their corpse would be cleaved and displayed to serve as a warning to others. There was also a nice little number called the scavenger's daughter. A device was used to compress the person's body while they were forced to sit with their knees against their chest, while their arms were tied behind their back. The device would then be closed, and fatal crushing would ensue. Other than the horrible executions, there are some other fun facts about the Tower of London. One was that, in addition to prisoners, it held a menagerie of exotic animals like polar bears and Bengal tigers and even monkeys. They were status symbols for the royalty who lived in the castle, but that didn't help the prisoners out much. Another not-so-fun fact, the last execution that took place at the Tower of London was that of a German spy named Joseph Jacobs, whose life was ended by a firing squad in 1941. The Tower of Blood, 14th century.
Just the name is enough to tell you that you don't want to be in prison in this next one. The Tower of Blood was built by the Ottoman Empire during the 15th century in the modern-day Greek city of Thessaloniki.
It was originally used as a watchtower and served as a part of the city's fortifications, but over time, it was converted into a prison and torture chamber where some less than savory things went on. The tower had a reputation for brutality and torture throughout the Ottoman Empire, and it was often used to intimidate and terrorize the local population. Prisoners were brought to the tower and subjected to all kinds of nasty treatment. They were starved, they were beaten, they were subjected to various forms of torture that included all kinds of spiky, stretch, and heavy things. One of the most infamous uses of the tower came during the Greek War of Independence in the early 19th century, when the Ottomans used it to imprison and torture Greek revolutionaries and their sympathizers. Lots of these prisoners were held in the tower for years, and key players in the war, like the Patriarch of Constantinople, Gregory V, and the Bishop of Thessaloniki, Gregory of Kalamasia, both lost their lives while imprisoned in the tower. Then, in 1826, the tower played a role in the mass disposal of the Ottoman Janissaries. The Janissaries were an elite military group that had become a powerful political force within the empire. The Sultan at the time, Mahmud II, didn't like how powerful they'd become and how much influence they were wielding in Ottoman politics, so he decided to wipe them out. Most of the carnage took place in Istanbul, but some of the Janissaries fled to Thessaloniki, where they were hunted down and given a slow, painful goodbye in the Tower of Blood. The event marked a significant turning point in Ottoman history. With the Janissaries eliminated as a political force, Mahmud was able to centralize power and push through a series of reforms aimed at modernizing and strengthening the Ottoman state, though it wouldn't really help the empire's decline. Less than 100 years later, the empire would dissolve for good.
Kodenma-cho Prison, Edo Japan, 17th through 19th centuries.
Edo Japan seems like it was a pretty interesting place. On the one hand, it was a period of Japanese history that was relatively peaceful. Art and culture flourished under the reign of the Tokugawa shoguns, and on the surface, things seemed pretty good. But there were also some pretty harsh laws and some pretty harsh customs. Social mobility was virtually non-existent, and citizens basically were not allowed to leave the country due to strict isolationist policies. And the prison system during this time, well, it certainly reflected the harsher side of things.
One of the most infamous Edo period prisons was Kodenma-cho Prison. It was used to hold prisoners of all kinds, from common criminals to political prisoners and prisoners of war. The prison was located in the capital, Edo, which was renamed Tokyo after the Tokugawa shogunate fell during the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Conditions in the prison were notoriously harsh. The prison was overcrowded and dirty, with prisoners often forced to sleep in cramped, gross cells with no bedding. The food was poor quality, and prisoners were often malnourished. Medical care was virtually non-existent, and disease ran rampant throughout the prison population. The prison was also known for its use of physical punishment, with inmates often beaten senseless for even minor infractions. Just like Edo society at large, Prisoners in Kodenma-cho were divided into different classes based on their crimes and social status. Much like prisons today, the ones deemed dangerous were held in a special ward, basically a supermax type of situation, where they were subjected to even harsher conditions and stricter rules than the rest of the prison population. Political prisoners were often held separately from common criminals and were subjected to particularly brutal treatment. The Tokugawa rulers didn't take kindly to anyone criticizing their leadership or trying to start any uprisings. Many of these political prisoners were executed, either by beheading or sometimes even crucifixion or being burnt alive at the stake, witch hunt style. Despite its brutal conditions, Kodenma-cho prison was an important institution in Edo, Japan. It was one of the largest and most well-known prisons in the country and was used to punish a wide range of crimes, from theft and murder to political dissent. The prison was also one of the few in Edo, Japan where the prisoners had contact with the outside world. Prisoners were allowed to receive visitors and were often able to communicate with people outside the prison walls. This made the prison a center of political and social discourse, and it was often a focus of attention for writers, artists, and intellectuals. Walnut Street Jail, 1790. Up until this point, the prisons we've looked at have been grimy, dark, torturous places that were built to inflict pain and dole out punishment. But towards the end of the 18th century, there was a push to reform prisons and turn them into places of rehabilitation. In the United States, the Quakers were pretty influential in trying to make this happen. The Quakers were very much into social justice and humanitarianism, and they wanted to build prisons where convicts could learn from their mistakes and come out reformed. However, sometimes this didn't go so well. The first modernish prison built in Philadelphia in 1790 was called the Walnut Street Jail.
Before we continue, let's get into the difference between a jail and a prison. Today, in the U.S. at least, a prison is where people go after they're convicted, and a jail is where they're held while they're awaiting trial, unless they have some money and can post bail. But back in 1790, the distinction between the two was often a bit blurry. Walnut Street Jail then was both a short-term holding facility and also a long-term penitentiary house, as they were known back then.
Anyway, the Walnut Street Jail was designed to separate prisoners from one another and give them the opportunity to reflect on their crimes and reform themselves through solitary confinement. What could go wrong? Each prisoner was confined to a single cell for 23 hours each day, where they meditated, found God, saw how the life they'd been living was flawed, and generally became better people. Or they simply went insane and came out even worse than they were when they went in. The reality of life in the Walnut Street Jail was far from the idealistic vision of the reformers who created it. The conditions in the jail were often squalid, with prisoners confined to small windowless cells with no access to fresh air or exercise. Many prisoners suffered from mental illness as a result of prolonged isolation, and some resorted to taking their own lives. Solitary confinement as a punishment clearly has a lot of downsides, and it's far from the reformative panacea that the reformers who built the jail thought it would be. Being stuck alone in a tiny cell for 23 hours a day often led to severe psychological trauma in prisoners, with some experiencing hallucinations, delusions, and other symptoms of mental illness. And if being stuck in solitary confinement wasn't bad enough, the Wall Street Jail also had a system of hard labor where prisoners were forced to work in absolute silence for up to 10 hours a day. So much for prison reform. Camp Sumter Prison, 1864 to 1865. 75 years later, one of the most notorious prisons in American history would pop up in Georgia towards the end of the Civil War.
Camp Sumter, also known as Andersonville Prison, was a Confederate prisoner of war camp that operated from February of 1864 to April of 1865. It was notorious for its overcrowding, lack of shelter, and poor sanitation, and that was a combination that would prove fatal for nearly a third of the prisoners held there while it was open.
The prison was designed to hold around 10,000 prisoners, but at its peak it held more than 3 times that number. The prisoners were housed in open-air, makeshift shelters with no protection from the elements, and they were forced to rely on contaminated water sources for drinking and bathing. As a result of the overcrowding and unsanitary conditions, disease spread like wildfire throughout the prison. The lack of medical care and supplies only exacerbated the problem, and thousands of prisoners died from diseases like dysentery, scurvy, and typhoid fever. It's estimated that around 45,000 Union soldiers were held at Camp Sumter during its operation, and of those, around 13,000 died. The exact number of fatalities is uncertain, though, because the Confederate authorities didn't keep very good records. They were too busy with the war. After the war, a trial was held to hold Confederate officials responsible for the horrors that went down at the camp. The camp's commanding officer, Captain Henry Wirtz, was the man of the hour. Wirtz was brought to trial in August of 1865, and the trial lasted for 2 months. Wirtz was charged with conspiring to impair the health and destroy the lives of Union prisoners, and also with deliberately withholding food and other supplies from the prisoners, acts that resulted in the deaths of thousands. He was eventually found guilty and was executed. It was one of the only executions of a prominent Civil War figure for war crimes. Cellular Jail, 1896 to 1937-ish.
The Andaman and Nicobar Islands are stunningly beautiful. Turquoise waters, white sand beaches, coral reefs. I'm talking classic island paradise. But up until the middle of the 20th century, they also housed one of the worst prisons in history.
The Cellular Jail, known as the Kala Pani, was a colonial prison located on islands in the Bay of Bengal. Despite being way over here, the islands were controlled by the British East India Company for a while. The prison was built by the British colonial government in India during the late 19th century, and they used it to punish Indian revolutionaries who were fighting for independence from British rule and had been deemed a threat. The conditions in Cellular Jail were horrible. Prisoners were subjected to forced labor, torture, and solitary confinement. The prison was designed with 7 wings arranged like spokes on a wheel, each containing 3 stories of small individual cells. The cells were designed to isolate prisoners from one another, making it difficult for them to communicate or organize any kind of resistance. Quite a few prominent Indian revolutionaries were imprisoned in the Cellular Jail, including members of the Indian National Army and the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association. The most famous inmate of the prison was probably Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, a revolutionary and Hindu nationalist who was speaking out for Indian independence. In 1911, he was sentenced to life in prison and spent the first 10 years of his sentence at Cellular Jail.
When India gained independence from Great Britain, and that was in 1947, Cellular Jail would eventually be decommissioned, but not before the Japanese arrived. In March of 1942, Japan took control of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands from the British and were just as unforgiving of Indian revolutionaries as the British.
At first, the Japanese were welcomed by a lot of Indian nationalists because they figured the Japanese could help liberate India from British colonial rule. But the Japanese quickly wore out their welcome and proved to be just as oppressive as the British. The Japanese gave many Indian freedom fighters who had been imprisoned at the Cellular Jail by the British a chance to fight for their freedom. On the Japanese side, of course, many of them joined the Indian National Army, or the INA, which was formed by the Japanese to fight against the British during World War II. But the INA didn't have many successful military campaigns, and many of the freedom fighters were captured by the British and sent to other POW camps, swapping one jail for another. All in all, the Japanese occupation of the island simply meant more persecution for Indians who just wanted their independence. It would come, eventually. The Japanese surrendered in 1945, and just 2 years later, India would gain its independence from Britain. Apartheid prison, 17th century to 1991. Robben Island is a little chunk of land that sits just off the coast of Cape Town, South Africa. The island was first used as a prison in the mid-17th century by the Dutch colonial government, who used it to lock up political prisoners and those who were deemed socially undesirable, like lepers and the mentally ill. But Robben Island became truly horrible during apartheid, which started in 1947. The South African government, led by the white minority National Party, used the island to imprison political dissidents and activists who opposed apartheid, a system of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination. From the 1960s onwards, many prominent anti-apartheid activists were imprisoned on Robben Island, including the late, great Nelson Mandela, who spent 18 of his 27 years in prison on the island. Life at Robben Island was obviously not great. Prisoners were subjected to forced labor, regular beatings, and all-in-all squalid sanitary conditions. They were often forced to work in quarries and mines and were given inadequate food and medical care. Many prisoners were also subjected to solitary confinement, which could last for years. The prison was also known for its use of torture and other forms of psychological abuse. Some prisoners were subjected to sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, and other forms of psychological manipulation in order to extract information or force confessions. In the 1980s, international pressure on the South African government to end apartheid grew, and calls for the release of political prisoners, including those on Robben Island, intensified. In 1990, The South African government began negotiations with the African National Congress, the main anti-apartheid political party, and other opposition groups. As part of these negotiations, the South African government released Nelson Mandela from prison in February 1990 after he had spent 27 years behind bars. In 1991, the South African government announced that it would close Robben Island as a prison, and the last prisoners were finally transferred off the island in 1996. The Hanoi Hilton, 1901 through 1990.
The Hanoi Hilton doesn't sound like such a bad place. Maybe there's a free continental breakfast, maybe room service, maybe even a pool. But back during the Vietnam War, the Hanoi Hilton wasn't a place you'd want to spend time in during your trip to the country. It was a notoriously brutal prison that held American and South Vietnamese soldiers, many of whom were mercilessly tortured for years on end.
The Hanoi Hilton, officially known as Ha Lo Prison, was built by the French colonial government back in 1896 to house Vietnamese political prisoners. But it gained its reputation later when it was used by the North Vietnamese to hold American POWs and other Allied forces during the war. The prison was originally designed to hold about 600 prisoners, but at times it held more than 2,000. Torture and starvation were a common everyday occurrence at the prison, and prisoners were often kept in solitary confinement for months or even years at a time. Some prisoners were forced to participate in propaganda broadcasts and false confessions aimed at undermining their loyalty to their own country. And with the conditions in the prison, it would make sense that a prisoner would say something just to make the pain stop. One American POW named Sam Johnson, who went on to become a U.S. representative, described the nasty use of meat hooks in the prison with brutal detail. Quote, "As a POW in the Hanoi Hilton, I could recall nothing from military survival training that explained the use of a meat hook suspended from the ceiling. It would hang above you in the torture room like a sadistic tease. You couldn't drag your gaze from it. During a routine torture session with the hook, the Vietnamese tied a prisoner's hands and feet, then bound his hands to his ankles, sometimes behind the back, sometimes in front. The ropes were tightened to the point that you couldn't breathe. Then, bowed or bent in half, the prisoner was hoisted up onto the hook to hang by ropes. Guards would return at intervals to tighten them until all feeling was gone, and the prisoner's limbs turned purple and swelled to twice their normal size. This would go on for hours, sometimes even days on end." End quote. Not a pretty picture at all. Fortunately, the Hanoi Hilton closed for good at the end of the war, and it's now a museum and fairly popular tourist destination for those wanting a sobering glimpse at the horrors of war. Little boxes of death, 20th century. Mongolia during the early 20th century was undergoing some pretty significant changes. In 1911, Mongolia declared independence from the Qing dynasty of China, and in 1921 it became a socialist state under Soviet influence. Under the regime that ruled the country from 1921 to 1990, the government set up a network of prisons and labor camps to punish political dissidents and other perceived enemies of the state. One of the most notorious of these was the State Security and Correctional Department, also known as the Mongolian KGB, which operated a series of prisons throughout the country. The largest and most well-known of these prisons was Ulaanbaatar Prison No. 461, which was notorious for its harsh conditions and torture of political prisoners. One of those pieces of torture involved horrible little boxes of death. The use of small wooden boxes as a form of punishment in Mongolian prisons was reportedly widespread during the early 20th century, particularly during the period of political instability and conflict in the country.
But you know what? There's very little evidence that it actually happened because of the secretive and repressive nature of the Mongolian regime. But this photo, published in National Geographic back in 1922, certainly seems to prove that the practice existed.
The boxes, known as punishment boxes, were typically small, cramped, and windowless, and were used to confine prisoners in a standing or crouching position. The prisoners would often be left in the boxes for days or weeks at a time, and would be given very little, if any, food or water. While the use of punishment boxes has officially been banned throughout Mongolia, there are still rumors that they continue to be used in some areas of the country. Maracaibo Prison, 1958 through 2013.
Finally, let's move into a few more modern prisons that have either just recently closed or are still in operation. You might think that the gauntlet of misery and torture you've been on so far is bad enough, but these next few could possibly be worse in terms of the sheer chaos and near perpetual state of violence.
Maracaibo Prison in Venezuela was a nightmare. It was opened in 1958 and originally built to hold around 700 inmates, but when it closed in 2013, there were over 3,700 cramped within its walls. The entire prison was basically run by the prisoners themselves, and they were pretty much left to their own devices. There would be occasional government raids on the prison, and police would confiscate piles of weapons and illegal substances. One time they even discovered a collection of endangered jungle animals housed in the prison, the inmates' own little prison zoo. The politics of the prison were handled through something called the prawn system. Prawn is a Venezuelan slang term for first man or leader. Under the prawn system, the most powerful inmate is designated as the prawn and is basically in charge of the prison. There would be rival prawns, though, and clashes between rival gangs was commonplace. So were riots. One of the worst riots came in 1994 when 108 inmates lost their lives. The riot started over a dispute between rival gangs, and it quickly escalated into violence that lasted for several days. The inmates set fire to the prison, and many died from smoke inhalation. To make matters even worse, there were over 200 children of the inmates also staying at the prison. They were kept in what could barely be described as nurseries, without access to basic sanitation or any kind of education. And a lot of those kids didn't make it through a lot of the violence that went on in the notorious Venezuelan prison. Humanity has a long history of locking people up. So we obviously didn't have time to get into all the prisons that have existed throughout history. What others are you curious about? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more Nutty History.